Welcome to this short introduction of the Westwind.Globalization library. This library provides database resource localization for .NET applications and ASP.NET applications in particular. It allows you to use database resources instead of regex resources to store your localization data in SQL Server. To get started, the first thing we can do is just navigate to the website and then pick up the NuGet link to actually install it. Let's flip over to Visual Studio here. And I'm going to create a new project, a new website, and an empty website. Okay, so then the next thing we can do is we can use the Package Manager console to find Westwind.Globalization. There it is, and we can install it. Okay, close and done. And if we look at the references here, we can see that indeed the Westwind.Globalization assembly was added, along with a couple of helper utilities classes that also are available. Then there also is a localization admin folder that was created that contains the localization admin form. Next, the web.config has been modified, and there's basically been added a new DB resource provider section, which is defined at the bottom here. Unfortunately, we need to reformat this, so Control A to select everything, Control F to reformat the document. And to do that, we say provide a connection string. So I'm just going to point out my local SQL server, a database called Localizations, and integrated security equals true. Okay, so the DB resource provider section basically configures the provider and it allows it to look for resources in a particular location. The most important thing here is the connection string as well as the resource table name, which I named Localizations. So in SQL Server right now, I do have a localizations database, but of course you can reference any database that you see fit. And there is no table inside of here as of now. Okay, so now that we have this set up, we can go ahead and actually fire up the localization admin form. So let's do that. So up comes the browser. And right now the form is completely blank because we haven't had any resources actually. And there's no resource table for it to work. So what we need to do is actually create the table. So the table's been created. And once this is all done, there are some temporary resources available so that we can actually check out and see how this works. Okay, so you can remove these resources, but it's nice to have something to at least play with. So the way that this works is that we have one or more resource sets in our application, and each one of these resource sets is similar to a regex file if you're using regex resources. So each resource set contains a number of resources inside of it, and those resources can then be loaded from the provider. So the resources here are listed, and you can see that it shows the different languages for each one of them. So the invariant or default locale, which in my case is English. Then I have a German mapping for Germans and French for some things. Okay, and I can go through here and actually click on each one of these and modify these values really easily. So if I want to add a new resource, let's say we want to add a new resource key called ready, and we want to set the value to ready. Now I have a new resource key that's been added and it shows up here. If I now go to the German item, I can say los and save. And French, I don't actually know what the French one is. Well, let's try LA maybe. I'm sure somebody will set me right on that. So now we have three values for ready, los, and LA here. Now, one other thing that you probably want to do from here right now is to actually import any resources that exist already. So if you go and look at the database right now, you can see that if I refresh, a localizations table has been created. And if I select the last few items out there, each one of those values should show up here. Okay, so there's my hello world. And each one of these values has three different values in it because there happens to be an invariant and a German and a French one for each one of them. Now notice that not all those values need to be present. Only the invariant key needs to be there so that we can actually see, so that it's actually localized in some way. Resource fallback in ASP.NET makes it possible to not have some resources available. And if those resources are not available, then it falls back to the next best thing. So if you come in with a Spanish version, a Spanish localized browser, it will fall back to the English version because there's no Spanish resources in here. So if we go back to this form now and I say I want to import existing resources, what it will do is it will go out to disk and look at any global and local resources and import them into the application. Now, if you don't have any resources yet, you might still want to do this because this form actually is localized. So if we import, we can see here that now there is a localization admin.localization admin. And if we go look at this here, we see there's actually a ton of values that are imported for this. So if I go look at, say, this save button, I can scroll down here a little bit. There's my save button, and here I can see the values for it. Okay, and these values I can now change and work with. If we flip over to the database right now and refresh here, you'll see that all those values have now been entered into the database. So these came originally from the resx files, and they've been imported into this database now. Okay, that's pretty cool, right? Because now we have our resx resources, and we can actually interactively edit them. And eventually, you can also export those resources back out to a resource file when you're done with editing. So if you want to use resx resources only and you don't want to use the database provider, eventually you can do that as well, as you can export your resources when you're done localizing. The next thing that we have to do is ensure that the provider is actually working. So far, we've created a table, added some resources, and imported some resources, and we know that the table is actually created and there's data in it. It's all working here, but we haven't really seen the provider work. Let's flip over back to Visual Studio, and let's go into web.config file to make sure that the provider is actually enabled. By default, this section here that enables the provider is automatically added when you import the NuGet package. But if you do this manually, make sure that you have a resource provider factory type set and have it set to DB simple resource provider factory, which is one of the two providers that are available in the Westwind.Globalization assembly. The DB simple resource provider is a provider that goes directly against the database, while the DB resource provider is one that goes through a .NET resource set and then into the database. So typically the DB simple resource provider is the quicker one to work. So now that we know that our application is configured for localization, we can now open up this resource test page, which also gets installed by the NuGet package. And it's basically a quick way that you can use to check and see whether everything's working okay. Okay, so when I run this, it basically tells me that we are running in the ENUS culture and ENUS UI culture. And here we could see a couple of different ways, a number of different ways actually, of how the resources can be accessed in an application. So the first thing is using the DB-res helper, and the second are the standard ASP.NET mechanisms that are used to access resources. Okay, you can see here that the values are actually getting localized. If you recall, we have a hello world key, and the actual translated value for this is hello cruel world. This second value here is in German because I'm explicitly forcing it to German. Okay, and then here's that same value displayed again through the resource provider. And here are a couple of WebForms specific resources that are being pulled in and being shown. So if we quickly take a look at the form here and look at the code behind, you can see that we're using in these first examples a DB-res helper class, which is a very quick way to access resources directly. So basically what this does, it uses the DB-res helper class and a T for translate method, where you specify the name of the resource set to access, the resource key to access, so this is hello world, and the resource set to actually access it in. If we go back over to the admin form in the browser here, and we go to the resources page, we know we have a hello world key, so that's the ID, in a resources resource set, and a value that is set to hello cruel world. So we know that the DB resource provider is actually working. So in the second example here, I'm calling the same method, but I'm explicitly forcing it to the German locale. So I'm saying that the values should show in German. And sure enough, if we go over into the browser and look in the view here, we see that the value is indeed in German. The next set of examples uses the ASP.NET native resource provider functionality. The first thing is the HTTP context.get global resource object. And basically this function takes a resource set name and the resource key as an ID. Now this works basically the same as this does up here. The difference is that this is totally specific to ASP.NET. It only works in ASP.NET, whereas the DB-REST stuff up here works in any application. So this is an easy way to access your resources. Okay, so there are two versions of this get global resource object. There's one in HTTP context and then one also on the page class. Since this is a WebForms page, the page object has a get global resource object property that we can use to access the value. The next example uses the meta resource key syntax, which is implicit resources. And basically these guys map by a resource key that can be found inside of the resource file. Then if we go over to the resource file, bring up the local resource set for resource test.aspx, we have a single key inside of here called lbl hello world label.text. So the .text extension basically tells ASP.NET that it's looking for this key with the .text extension, which in turn maps to the text property of the control that it's bound to. So here we're binding the text property of this label to the lbl hello world label.text resource key. Another way that you can use in WebForms as well is the resource expression syntax, which basically looks like this. So here we specify the name of a global resource, which in this case is resources, and the resource ID that we want to bind it to. Okay, so again, this is the same value as these values that we're using up here and up here, but it's just a different syntax that you can get the value in here. So basically you can use this to assign a value to any property in an ASP.NET control. All three of these items are specific to WebForms because they're using local resource objects, which only works in WebForms. The last example here is get local resource object. We want to go to the page specific resource file and look for this very specific key inside of there. So again, if I flip over to the resource form here, the resource set is resource test.aspx, and I have a key inside of here with a specific name that I'm looking up. And inside of here, I'm simply referencing this. So get local resource object basically gives you the capability to access any resource key that is embedded inside of that local resource without having to go through one of the implicit mechanisms. Okay, so far we know that the resources work, but we haven't actually seen it work in a different language. So what happens if I switch into a different language now? If I bring up my browser and go to the language settings and switch into German, if everything goes well, we should see the language now switch into German. And sure enough, here's my German.de. The language has been switched. And we also see that the resources have automatically switched into German. So here's the German global resource, and here's that local resource that we're embedding onto the form. So this allows you to basically switch very easily into other languages. So how does that work? It's not totally automatic that ASP.NET does that, but rather you have to tell ASP.NET to do this automatic culture switching. So here I'm using a web form, and I'm using a web form specific setting that basically automatically switches the culture and UI culture into the browser specified language. Okay, so this is page specific and it only works in web forms. If I take this stuff out of here and rerun the page, you'll see that it reverts back to ENUS. There's also a global setting for this available, and it's on that same globalization key we used a second ago. And I can say culture equals auto, ENUS, and UI culture equals auto ENUS. Now if I run it again, we should be back to the same behavior that we just saw. So this setting here is global for ASP.NET, and it applies to any technology. So you can use this with ASP.NET MVC, you can use it with WebPages, it will work in Web API, it will work anywhere basically. If you need more control and you need to do this programmatically, you can also go in and use a helper method that is provided as part of the Westwind utilities. So I can go in here and I bring up a global.asax template. Okay, and I'm going to create that file, and I'm going to open that and open it up to the begin request method. Now I can add the web utils class, which comes from Westwind.Utilities, and use the set user locale method to basically switch into a custom language. If I just use this parameter here, just leave it as it is, I basically get the same behavior that we've been seeing all along. Okay, we still do the switching even though there's no more web.config setting there. So this is just an explicit way of setting a culture. So I can say here, for example, that I want everything to be in Swiss German if I wanted to. So this helper allows you to do that really easily. So I have to recompile. And let me just make sure, yep, that's out. Reload the page. And now you can see it's actually being forced into that particular language. So you notice now everything is forced into German because we've basically switched to a German-based language. If I force it into something like es.mx, so Mexican Spanish, for example, what do you expect will happen here? Well, if we do this, if we refresh, we see the language switch into ESMX, but we notice that the language here displayed falls back to English. And that's because English is the default language, and that's what resource fallback in ASP.NET actually does. If it doesn't find a match, it goes to the lower language. So if it doesn't find Spanish Mexican, it goes to Spanish, and then it goes to invariant. Now the application form is also localized, the administration form. Okay, so I'm going to recompile this. If we reload, we should be back to German now because my browser is in a German language. And if we go to the localization page and refresh, it should now translate into German because all the resources applied to this form are both in English and German. As you can see here, if we go to this page, you can see that most things are provided in both English and German. Another thing that you can do is you can generate strongly typed resources that you can then use in your ASP.NET applications. You can use these strongly typed resources both in your application code as well as on your markup pages. So in order to do that, let's actually add a few more resources. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a new resource set altogether. So I'm going to add a save option, and I'm going to create a new resource set called common words. And I'm going to add one more. Now I'm going to refresh the page here so we can see this new resource set. There it is. And here's my invariant. And so let's add another resource. Let's call it cancel. And add. I'm going to translate that and go loading. OK. And add another resource. Let's call it edit. And add that resource and then translate it. Oops. What was that? Edit. And use that and save. Okay, so here we've just created a new resource set basically and added a few keys to it. Okay, so now I want to export this. So what the generate strong resource export does is basically go through each one of the global resources, so this one, and generates a strongly generated resource file. So let me do that. So it's been run. If we go back into Visual Studio here, and I go into this see all files view, now I can see that there's been a resources file that's been created. Okay, if I include this in my project, I can now open that up. And what we'll find here is that we've basically generated strongly typed resources for both common words and resources in the app resources namespace. The app resources namespace is configurable in the DB resource provider. You can specify what the namespace is. And then the two classes basically have entries for each one of the resource IDs and has the localization that will actually drive these values. So to test this out, let's go over into our form here. And there's some code on the bottom here that's commented out because those resources typically don't exist. So I have to add a reference to appresources.resources. And then now I have access to those resources as strongly typed resources. So here's my hello world thing. Well, let's do ready maybe. Okay, and then I can also say HR and equals common words dot cancel. Okay, if we now bring this up in the browser, here are our values, ready and cancel, right? So if we switch into the the German language, we should also see the localized values. So go back over here and reload. Now here's our strongly typed resource generated in German, and the cancel one apparently we didn't actually translate. So let's go over and see if we can do that. Let's go back over here and let's see cancel. Yep, we didn't translate that. So let's translate it and go. Stornieren, use. Okay, save that. And now I can also say reload resources. And what this will do actually is it'll unload the resources that are loaded and then bring up the updated value. So now you can see here it's los and then here it's stornieren. So we've now basically made a change to our resource set and actually changed the value on the fly. So this is something that you can't easily do with the resx-based provider because resources are, of course, statically linked. But with a database provider, of course, you can make these kind of changes interactively. And this concludes our introduction to the Westwind.Globalization library. I hope you found this introduction useful, and hopefully this will help you in getting started quickly. If you find something interesting here, go ahead and visit us on the web, or come see our GitHub page where you can get the full source code, and if you like, make some contributions. Pull requests are welcome. So thank you for watching this video.